yet, for immigrants, such extremities are the norm. This book begins with Machado's story because it illustrates how tough-on-crime laws intersected with harsh immigration policies in the last 3 decades to make millions of immigrants vulnerable to deportation based on criminal acts, even minor ones, that had been committed years or decades earlier. Machado's history also shows how much had changed between 2004, when she was first arrested on felony charges for writing the fraudulent checks, and 2015, when her immigration status became the central issue in what was a routine traffic stop. The integration of local police with immigrant enforcement in the 2010s cast a much wider net, entrapping millions of long-term immigrant residents in the jaws of an enhanced deportation machine. By the end of Obama's second term, he had earned the dubious distinction of deporting over 3 million people, more immigrants than any other president in history. In doing so, the 21st century became an era of mass immigrant detention and deportation. There are millions of other immigrants like Mayra Machado who have their own stories of living in the United States, some with U.S. citizen children, some having committed crimes, but all sharing the experience of being locked up and deported. Machado's story should be familiar to us from recent media accounts, but the long history of how we got from there to here is less understood. Building on the exciting new scholarship in recent years, this book provides an explanation of how, where, and why non-citizens were put behind bars in the United States from the late 19th century to the present. Through select granular experiences of detention over the course of more than 140 years, I explain how America built the world's largest system for imprisoning immigrants. History of immigrant detention. From the late 19th century, when the U.S. government held hundreds of Chinese in federal prisons pending deportation, to the early 20th century, when it caged hundreds of thousands of immigrants in insane asylums, to World War I and World War II, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, declared tens of thousands of foreigners enemy aliens and locked them up in Immigration and Naturalization Service INS camps in Texas and New Mexico, and through the 1980s detention of over 125,000 Cuban and almost 23,000 Haitian refugees, the incarceration of foreigners nationally has ebbed and flowed. Although far more immigrants are being held in prison today than at any other time in U.S. history, earlier moments of immigration incarceration echo present-day patterns. In fact, the legal debates about incarcerating immigrants indefinitely pending deportation stretches all the way back to the late 1880s, and the rates of institutionalization, all forms of incarceration, in the early to mid-20th century rival those of the 21st century. Until very recently, the study of incarcerated immigrants has fallen in the crack between prison and migration studies. Migration scholars focus on movement of people across borders and the communities they establish in their adopted countries. Prison scholarship has mostly ignored the question of migrant incarceration, focusing instead on the mass imprisonment of largely black and brown citizens. Although the issue of migrant incarceration is touched upon in both fields, there is little sustained effort to describe, measure, or account for their imprisonment, especially before the 1980s. Recent books focusing on the rise of immigrant and refugee detention since the 1970s help to flesh out the latest period of mass immigrant incarceration, and particularly the link between immigration and criminal law. These scholars show how legislation and specific policies from the 1980s to the present have resulted in the massive growth of migrant detention. The historical studies of Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco help us to understand where and how immigrants were detained in the first half of the 20th century. The government incarcerated 300,000 migrants on Angel Island from 1910 to 1940, more than half of whom were Chinese, 100,000, and Japanese, 85,000, making it by far the largest detention center at the time. Ellis Island processed many more than Angel Island, around 12 million, but fewer people were held there, and they were detained for shorter periods. Legal historical studies of deportation also offer a framework for understanding the laws that provided for detention pursuant to deportation, but oftentimes these works pay short shrift to the experience of detention itself. Various scholars have argued that when writing about immigration and citizenship, we must not only focus on those coming from outside the country, hoping to become part of the national community, but must also consider the ways in which insiders have been rendered non-citizens and foreigners. Native Americans and enslaved Africans are the most obvious examples of people who were very much inside the nation and yet were rendered aliens legally, politically, and socially.